A perfect sunny day can vanish in an instant. This same unpredictability has rewritten our world. From empires shattered by storms to invasions frozen in their tracks, the weather is history's most powerful and chaotic wild card. In this journey, we will uncover 25 astonishing moments where a simple shift in the wind or a sudden drop in temperature changed everything. You will discover how our entire civilization has been secretly shaped by forces beyond our control. We will see how a single fog bank saved a revolution and how a years-long drought can collapse a golden age. What is the one weather event you believe altered our modern world the most? Two of the greatest armadas ever assembled met their end not by human hands but by the sea itself. In the late 13th century, Kublai Khan, the mighty Mongol emperor, set his sights on Japan. His first invasion fleet in 1274 was formidable, a powerful force that landed on Japanese shores and fought the samurai to a stalemate. Just as the Mongols were planning their next assault, a violent storm erupted. The invaders were forced back to their ships to wait out the weather, a decision that proved fatal. The tempest smashed the Mongol fleet against the coastline, drowning thousands of soldiers and forcing a complete retreat. Yet Kublai Khan was not deterred. 7 years later, he launched a second, even larger invasion force. Historical accounts suggest this was one of the largest naval fleets in history until that point, carrying a staggering number of troops. They established a beachhead and for weeks engaged in a brutal war of attrition with the defending samurai. Just as the Japanese defenses were on the verge of collapse, the weather intervened once more. A colossal typhoon, far more powerful than the first, churned through the Korean Strait. For 2 full days, the divine wind, or kamikaze, hammered the Mongol fleet. The massive Chinese and Korean ships, lashed together for stability, were torn apart by the hurricane-force winds and swallowed by colossal waves. Nearly the entire invasion force was destroyed, with countless men lost to the sea. The few survivors who made it to shore were swiftly executed by the victorious samurai. This double miracle did more than just save Japan from foreign conquest. It forged a powerful national belief that the islands were divinely protected, a sacred land watched over by the gods. This idea of divine favor became a cornerstone of Japanese culture and national identity, a myth that would be invoked centuries later to inspire fierce patriotism and militarism. How different might history be if a simple change in atmospheric pressure had steered those typhoons away from the Korean Strait? Just as the kamikaze secured an island nation's destiny, another divine wind would soon reshape the fate of Europe. Across the world, another powerful empire faced a similar reckoning with the sea. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain assembled a colossal fleet known as the Invincible Armada. His mission was monumental: to ferry a vast army from the Spanish Netherlands and conquer Protestant England, overthrowing Queen Elizabeth I. This was not just a military campaign, it was a holy war, a Catholic crusade to return England to the fold. The Armada was a breathtaking sight, a forest of masts and sails comprising 130 ships, carrying 30,000 men and 2,500 cannons. They sailed up the English Channel in a formidable crescent formation, a seemingly unstoppable force. Yet the English Navy, though smaller, was nimble and innovative. Their ships were faster and their guns could fire more rapidly. They harried the Spanish formation for days, using hit-and-run tactics to pick off stragglers and prevent the Armada from linking up with its army. The Spanish fleet was battered but still largely intact when it was forced to anchor off the coast of Calais. It was here that the English launched a brilliant and terrifying night attack, sending 8 fire ships, old vessels packed with pitch and gunpowder and set ablaze, directly into the crowded Spanish anchorage. Panic erupted. Spanish captains, fearing these floating bombs, cut their anchor cables in a desperate scramble to escape, scattering their perfect formation into the darkness. Now disorganized and low on supplies, the Spanish commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, made a fateful decision. He could not sail back down the English Channel against the wind and the waiting English fleet. His only option was to lead his battered armada on a long and perilous retreat home, sailing north around Scotland and Ireland. It was a calculated risk that turned into a catastrophe. The North Atlantic in late summer is a treacherous place, and the armada sailed directly into a series of relentless, punishing gales. These were not the quick typhoons of the Pacific, but slow, grinding storms that battered the already damaged ships for weeks. The wooden vessels, built for the calm Mediterranean, were torn apart by the colossal waves and hurricane-force winds. They were driven onto the rocky shores of Scotland and Ireland, smashed to splinters. Thousands of Spanish soldiers and sailors, already weakened by disease and hunger, drowned in the frigid waters or were slaughtered on the beaches by local forces. Of the 130 ships that had set out with such pride, fewer than half would ever make it back to Spain. The storm had accomplished what the English Navy could not, the utter destruction of the invincible armada. The impact was immediate and profound. Spain's dream of conquering England was shattered, its naval supremacy broken. England's victory secured its independence as a Protestant nation, allowing it to grow into a global maritime power that would eventually build an empire upon which the sun never set. The balance of power in Europe shifted decisively, all because a fleet of mighty galleons met a force of nature they could not possibly conquer. That same merciless force of nature that shattered fleets could also bring a continent to its knees. In 1812, the master of Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte, stood at the peak of his power. His Grand Armée was the most formidable military force the world had ever seen, a multinational host of over 600,000 men. His goal was to force Tsar Alexander I of Russia back into an economic alliance against Britain. Confident of a quick, decisive victory, Napoleon led his massive force deep into Russia, expecting the Tsar to surrender after a single major battle. But the Russians refused to fight on his terms. They retreated, drawing the French ever deeper into their vast territory, and pursued a brutal strategy of scorched earth, burning their own cities and crops to deny the invaders any sustenance. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow in September, he found a city largely abandoned and set ablaze, leaving him with no supplies and no one to negotiate with. He waited in the empty capital for 5 weeks, expecting a surrender that never came. With winter approaching and his position untenable, the order for retreat was finally given on October 19th. The first snows began to fall. No one could have predicted the ferocity of what was to come. The winter of 1812 arrived not just early, but with a savagery that defied belief. Temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees. This was not a gentle snowfall, it was a frozen hell. The French soldiers, still dressed in their summer uniforms, began to freeze to death by the thousands. Men would sit down for a moment's rest and never get up, their bodies turning to ice statues in minutes. The most chilling accounts describe entire regiments huddled together for warmth, found days later as a single, solid block of frozen corpses. The horses suffered a grislier fate. They died in such vast numbers that the retreating army's path became a road of carcasses, a macabre trail that stretched for hundreds of miles. Without horses, the army's supply wagons and artillery were abandoned. Discipline collapsed completely. The Grand Armée became a starving, desperate mob, fighting each other for scraps of food or strips of clothing torn from the dead. The Russian Cossacks harried them constantly, but the true enemy was the cold. Of the more than 600,000 men who marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 ever staggered back out. Napoleon had left his army to race back to Paris, his reputation for invincibility shattered beyond repair. The catastrophic failure of the Russian campaign was the turning point. It shattered the myth of Napoleon's genius and emboldened all of Europe to rise against him. Within 2 years, he was forced into exile. the geopolitical map was redrawn, with Russia emerging as a dominant continental power for the next century. All of this was set in motion not by a general's brilliant strategy, but by the simple, brutal, and unforgiving descent of the thermometer. While empires fell to ice and sea, another climate disaster was quietly brewing in the heart of America. The Great Plains, a vast expanse of grassland once known as the Great American Desert, had been transformed by a wave of homesteaders in the early 20th century. Lured by high wheat prices and promises of fertile soil, farmers used powerful new gasoline tractors to rip up the ancient, deep-rooted buffalo grass that had held the topsoil in place for millennia. For a few wet years, this worked wonderfully, creating a wheat boom that earned the region a new name, the breadbasket of the world. But the grasslands had always been a delicate balance, and that balance was about to shatter. A severe drought settled over the plains in the early 1930s, and with the protective grass cover gone, there was nothing left to hold the earth down. The soil turned to powder, then the winds came. They began as dust storms or black blizzards that turned day into night. These were not mere clouds of dirt, they were colossal walls of rolling topsoil, thousands of feet high, moving with a terrifying roar. The dust was so fine it seeped through every crack in homes, coating furniture, food, and the lungs of those who breathed it. People died from dust pneumonia, a slow suffocation. On one day in April 1935, a day known as Black Sunday, a single storm carried away an estimated 300 million tons of topsoil, stripping farms down to bare, hard-packed clay. This was the Dust Bowl, an ecological catastrophe of staggering scale. The land quite literally blew away. The human cost was immeasurable. Families who had lost everything they owned packed their few remaining belongings into beat-up trucks and set out on Route 66, heading for the promised land of California. They were called Ockies, a term that came to represent all the displaced farmers from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. This mass exodus of nearly 2.5 million people was one of the largest internal migrations in American history. They arrived in California not as pioneers but as refugees in their own country, often met with hostility and forced into desperate poverty as migrant laborers. The social fabric of the entire nation was strained. This human tragedy, documented in photographs and seared into the national consciousness by John Steinbeck's novel The Grapes of Wrath, forced the federal government to act. The disaster directly influenced President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, leading to massive soil conservation programs and the creation of the Soil Conservation Service. The government began teaching farmers new techniques like crop rotation and terracing, and planted vast windbreaks of trees to try to heal the land. The very relationship between Americans and their environment was forever changed, sparking the modern conservation movement. The Dust Bowl proved that human ambition, when pitted against the immutable laws of nature, could create a disaster that would reshape a country's landscape, its people, and its very soul. Silence fell over the Continental Army, a quiet born of pure dread. It was August 29, 1776, and George Washington's forces were trapped. After a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Long Island, the remnants of his army, just 9,000 men, were pinned with their backs against the East River. Behind them, the cold, deep water. In front of them, the most powerful military on earth, a force of over 20,000 British regulars and Hessian mercenaries. The British commander, General William Howe, had halted his attack, content to finish the job in the morning with a full, crushing assault. Surrender seemed not just likely, but inevitable. The entire American Revolution, barely 2 months old, was hours from being extinguished. Washington faced an impossible choice: stand and be annihilated, or attempt a retreat across a wide river in full view of the enemy. He chose the river. Under the cover of darkness, he ordered every small boat, every scow, every rowboat that could be found to be gathered on the Brooklyn shore. The plan was a desperate gamble, a silent, nighttime evacuation. The soldiers began to file onto the boats, their movements hushed, their equipment wrapped in cloth to muffle any sound. But as the night wore on, a new terror emerged. The wind shifted, blowing directly from the north. This was a disaster. It meant the large, sail-powered ferries and cargo boats, essential for moving hundreds of men at a time, were stuck. They could not sail against the wind. The evacuation slowed to a crawl. With every passing minute, the window of darkness was closing. The first hints of dawn would reveal their escape to the British sentries, and the redcoats would open fire, turning the river into a slaughterhouse. Just as hope was fading, a strange and unseasonable weather phenomenon began to creep across the water. A thick, dense fog, uncommon for that time of year, rolled in from the ocean. It did not simply settle, it thickened into an impenetrable blanket, swallowing the entire shoreline and the river. This was not a light mist, but a deep, opaque wall of white that muffled all sound and reduced visibility to just a few feet. To the terrified American soldiers waiting on the docks, it felt like a miracle. The fog provided the perfect cloak. Under its cover, the rowboats could work frantically, back and forth, loading men until they were nearly swamped. The final men to leave, including Washington himself, stood guard on the empty Brooklyn shore, staring into a whiteness so complete they could not see the water's edge. The fog held, defying the rising sun. It lingered just long enough for the very last boat to push off and disappear into the gloom. As the final soldiers landed safely in Manhattan, the fog lifted as suddenly as it had arrived, vanishing under the morning sun. British soldiers, stirring in their camps, looked across the river and rubbed their eyes in disbelief. The entire American army was gone. They had vanished as if spirited away by ghosts. That one night of fog had saved the Continental Army from certain destruction. Had the weather been clear, the revolution would have ended on the banks of the East River. Instead, Washington lived to fight another day, and the fragile dream of American independence was preserved by a quiet, mysterious, and perfectly timed gift from the atmosphere. A century before the potato blight became synonymous with Irish suffering, an even deadlier climate disaster struck. The winter of 1740 was not merely cold, it was a geological event. For 21 days in December, temperatures across Ireland plummeted to levels never before recorded, freezing rivers solid and locking the entire island in a grip of iron. This was the Great Frost, and it was only the beginning. When the thaw finally came, it was followed by relentless, torrential rains and bitter winds that lasted through the spring and summer, destroying the sprouting grain and preventing any new crops from taking root. The result was a complete agricultural collapse. The potato, which would later become the sole staple of the poor, was not yet the dominant crop. This famine struck the very foundations of the Irish food supply, wiping out stores of oats, barley, and wheat. With no harvest and no relief from the British authorities who governed the island, mass starvation began. People resorted to eating nettles, grass, and even the family dog in a desperate bid to survive. Contemporary accounts describe entire families found dead in their cottages, their mouths stained green from the weeds they had consumed. The death toll was staggering, with estimates suggesting that nearly 40% of the Irish population perished from hunger or the diseases that preyed upon the malnourished. This catastrophe, the Great Frost and the famine it spawned, fundamentally altered Irish society. It demonstrated with brutal clarity the island's profound vulnerability to a single bad season, a lesson that was tragically ignored. In the decades that followed, the Irish poor became increasingly dependent on the potato, a crop that could feed a family on a small plot of land but was terrifyingly susceptible to disease. The precedent set by the Great Frost was one of utter devastation, a blueprint for a disaster that would replay itself on an even larger scale just over 100 years later. The landscape of suffering was already carved by ice, long before the first potato ever turned black and rotten. The same ocean that could conjure a life-saving fog could also create a perfect stage for tragedy. Decades after the Great Frost, the North Atlantic presented mariners with an entirely different kind of danger, one born of deceptive stillness. In April 1912, the RMS Titanic, the largest and most luxurious ship ever built, was on its maiden voyage across this frozen corridor. The common story focuses solely on the iceberg, but the weather that night set the scene for disaster with a series of quiet, interconnected failures. A powerful high-pressure system had settled over the region, creating conditions of exceptional clarity and, most critically, an unusually calm sea. The surface of the ocean was described as a flat, glassy pane, a condition veteran sailors called a millpond. This eerie calm was beautiful, but it was deadly. Without even a light breeze to create ripples or whitecaps, there were no telltale waves breaking around the base of the floating icebergs. Under normal conditions, these breaking waves would have made the bergs visible from a much greater distance, shimmering white against the dark water. On this night, they were rendered nearly invisible, dark shapes cloaked by the dark sea until they were terrifyingly close. This high-pressure system may have played another, more subtle role. Some climatologists now believe it helped drive the Labrador Current further south than was typical for that time of year, pushing a massive armada of icebergs directly into the transatlantic shipping lanes. The Titanic was sailing into a minefield that the calm weather had expertly disguised. When lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee finally spotted the dark mass looming ahead, they rang the bridge with the now infamous warning. The ship turned, but it was far too late. The calm sea had robbed them of the precious extra minutes they needed. The impact was not a dramatic, shattering crash, but more of a long, grinding tear along the starboard side, a sound one survivor described as the sound of calico being slowly ripped. The iceberg itself was not a jagged mountain of ice, but a low-lying, dark blue berg which had overturned, exposing the water-worn ice below the waterline, making it even harder to see against the black ocean. In the aftermath, the world was left reeling. How could this unsinkable marvel be lost on such a serene night? The public outcry was immediate and global. The investigation that followed led to the first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea in 1914. This treaty established the International Ice Patrol to monitor iceberg dangers in the North Atlantic, a service that continues to this day. It mandated 24-hour radio watch on all passenger ships and required that there be enough lifeboats for every person on board. The Titanic's tragedy, sculpted by a specific and cruel set of atmospheric conditions, did not just sink a ship. It forged the very foundation of modern maritime safety, rewriting the rules of the sea for every vessel that would follow. Long before the kamikaze saved Japan, another divine wind was already carving its name into history. In 492 BC, the Persian Empire was the superpower of the ancient world, an immense realm stretching from India to Egypt. Its king, Darius I, looked west toward the collection of quarrelsome, independent city-states known as Greece. His first plan for invasion was as ambitious as it was direct. He ordered his general, Mardonius, to lead a massive joint army and naval fleet around the northern coast of the Aegean Sea, to subdue Thrace and Macedon before sweeping down into Greece itself. The fleet was the key, a vast armada of at least 300 triremes and countless supply ships carrying tens of thousands of soldiers. Their route took them past a formidable and sacred headland, the peninsula of Mount Athos, a mountain that rises sheer from the sea. As the fleet attempted to round this treacherous cape, the weather turned monstrous. A violent northeasterly gale, known as a Hellespontian wind, roared down from the Black Sea. This was no ordinary storm. The wind funneled between the mountains, creating a maelstrom of colossal waves that smashed directly into the Persian fleet, which was trapped against a lee shore with no escape. The wooden triremes, built for the calmer waters of the eastern Mediterranean, were utterly helpless. They were tossed like toys, driven onto the rocky cliffs and shattered into splinters. The historian Herodotus recorded the catastrophic loss, claiming the storm destroyed 300 ships and drowned 20,000 men. The invasion force was annihilated in a single afternoon. The storm off Mount Athos was more than a military setback, it was a divine omen. For the Greeks, it was a clear sign that the gods favored them, that the very elements had risen to defend their homeland. This disaster forced Darius to abandon his northern strategy. It bought the Greek city-states, particularly Athens and Sparta, a precious 10 years to prepare. They did not waste it. They bickered and forged alliances, built new warships, and trained their hoplite armies. When the Persians returned a decade later, they came by a different route, leading to the legendary stand at Marathon. There, the outnumbered Athenians achieved a stunning victory, a triumph that might never have been possible without the breathing room granted by that earlier catastrophic storm. The wind at Mount Athos did not just scatter a fleet, it altered the entire timetable of history, setting the stage for the birth of Western civilization as we know it. A volcanic eruption on the other side of the world can plunge entire continents into darkness. In April 1815, Mount Tambora on the island of Sumbawa in the Dutch East Indies exploded with a force that is still unmatched in recorded history. The mountain itself was torn apart, its peak vanishing into the sky as over 36 cubic miles of rock and ash were blasted into the atmosphere. The immediate death toll was horrific, but the true global catastrophe was just beginning. That immense cloud of sulfuric ash and aerosols did not simply dissipate. It rose high into the stratosphere, where it began to spread like a vast, invisible shroud around the entire planet. This layer of particles acted as a mirror, reflecting sunlight back into space and preventing its warmth from reaching the Earth's surface. The result was a planetary chill that reached its peak the following year. 1816 became known as the year without a summer. Across the northern hemisphere, the seasons simply failed. In New England, snow fell in June and frosts killed crops in July and August. Farm fields from New York to China were barren, the corn and wheat stunted by unrelenting cold. In Europe, desperate peasants slaughtered their starving livestock as pastures turned to mud. The price of grain skyrocketed, leading to bread riots and widespread famine. In Switzerland, a group of literary friends found themselves trapped indoors by the incessant cold rain and gloom. To pass the time during what should have been a pleasant summer holiday, they challenged each other to write ghost stories. From this enforced confinement, Mary Shelley conceived her tale of a scientist who cobbles together life from death, giving the world Frankenstein. Her husband, the poet Percy Shelley, wrote of a sunless world in his poem Darkness. This single geological event, mediated through the weather, had created a unique crucible for cultural innovation, birching one of the most enduring myths of the modern age. The global fallout was profound, spurring a wave of migration from the cold, hungry northeastern United States to the more temperate Midwest. It demonstrated with terrifying clarity how interconnected our world had become and how fragile human civilization remains in the face of a planet's raw power. While volcanoes could chill the globe, a single hurricane could unleash a flood of biblical proportions. In late October 1998, Hurricane Mitch formed over the Caribbean Sea, a storm that would soon become one of the most destructive in recorded history. It stalled just off the coast of Honduras, not as a typical fast-moving system, but as a monstrous, nearly stationary Category 5 hurricane. For 3 agonizing days, it churned in place, pulling an unimaginable volume of moisture from the ocean and dumping it ceaselessly over the mountains of Central America. This was not just a storm of wind, but a storm of water. The rainfall totals were beyond comprehension, with some areas receiving over 75 inches of rain. The ground, saturated beyond its limits, simply gave way. Entire mountainsides, stripped of trees from decades of deforestation, liquefied into colossal rivers of mud. These mudslides swept down valleys, burying whole villages in an instant. In Nicaragua, the Casita volcano collapsed under the deluge, sending a wall of mud and rock that obliterated the town of El Porvenir and killed over 2,000 people in a single horrific event. The Choluteca River in Honduras swelled to over 6 times its normal width, transforming the capital city of Tegucigalpa into a raging inland sea where survivors clung to rooftops for days. The human cost was staggering, with an estimated 11,000 people killed across the region and millions left homeless. The economic infrastructure of Honduras and Nicaragua was erased. Banana and coffee plantations, the backbone of their economies, were washed away. Roads, bridges, and entire neighborhoods vanished under mud and debris. The disaster set both nations back by decades, wiping out 50 years of economic development in a matter of days. But from this unimaginable destruction emerged a profound shift in perspective. The catastrophe forced the world and the region itself to confront its vulnerability. Hurricane Mitch became a brutal catalyst for change, leading directly to the creation of the Central American Coordination Center for Natural Disaster Prevention. It sparked an international focus on disaster risk reduction, pushing governments to invest in early warning systems, reforestation projects, and community-based emergency planning. The storm revealed that in an age of climate uncertainty, preparing for the wrath of nature was no longer optional but essential for survival itself. A strange darkness fell across the world in the year 536. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote of a sun that gave no more light than the moon, a dim and feeble orb that cast no shadows even at noon. This was not a fleeting eclipse but a gloom that lingered for 18 months. Temperatures plummeted and snow fell in the middle of summer as far south as China. This was the Dust Veil event, a climatic catastrophe that marked the beginning of the late antique Little Ice Age. For years, the cause was one of history's great mysteries. Now, evidence points to a cataclysmic volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland or North America, that was so powerful it blasted millions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere, creating a permanent shroud around the planet. The effect on agriculture was immediate and devastating. Crops failed from Europe to the Middle East. The chronicles speak of a great famine, of people eating bitter, inedible seeds and even turning to cannibalism in their desperation. This widespread malnutrition created the perfect breeding ground for disease. Just as societies were at their weakest, the bubonic plague arrived. This was the first recorded pandemic of the Justinian plague, a terrifying illness that swept out of Egypt and into the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. The empire under Emperor Justinian had been on the verge of reconquering the lost western territories of Rome, but the twin blows of famine and plague shattered that dream. The empire lost perhaps a quarter of its population, its tax base evaporated, and its armies were decimated. It never recovered its former strength or ambition. The same story of collapse played out across Eurasia. In Scandinavia, a third of all villages were abandoned. In the steppes of Central Asia, nomadic tribes were forced to migrate en masse to find new pastures, setting off waves of conflict that toppled kingdoms. The Dust Veil of 536 did not just cause a few bad years. It severed the world from its classical past, crippling empires and depopulating continents. It was a climatic reset button that helped usher in the Dark Ages, proving that a single geological event, mediated through the weather, could erase the future an entire civilization had planned for itself. The fury that reshaped continents was about to be unleashed on a single, unsuspecting nation. On the night of November 26, 1703, a hurricane of almost unimaginable power began to tear across southern England. This was not a simple winter gale, but an extratropical cyclone of such ferocity that it would be remembered for centuries as the Great Storm. For 9 relentless hours, winds estimated at over 120 miles per hour screamed across the countryside. They ripped the lead sheeting from the roofs of cathedrals, upended thousands of windmills, and flattened entire forests. but the storm's most concentrated wrath was reserved for the Royal Navy, Britain's primary defense and the very source of its growing power. The fleet was caught completely by surprise, trapped in the shallow anchorages along the Thames estuary and the Downs. Ships were torn from their moorings and hurled against each other or driven onto sandbanks and shattered. The HMS Restoration, a mighty third-rate ship of the line, was lost with all hands, every single one of her 286 men. In total, 13 warships were sunk and more than 1,500 sailors drowned that night, a naval disaster on a scale not seen since the Spanish Armada. On land, the death toll was even higher, with thousands perishing as buildings collapsed and floodwaters surged. The public and the government were utterly stunned. In an age when science was still young, such a cataclysm could only be interpreted as an act of God. Ministers preached from their pulpits that the storm was a divine punishment for the nation's sins. This interpretation, however, was challenged by a journalist and writer named Daniel Defoe. He was so profoundly affected by the event that he published a groundbreaking book, The Storm, just months later. Defoe did something unprecedented. He placed advertisements in newspapers across the country, actively soliciting first-hand accounts, weather data, and damage reports from ordinary citizens. He compiled these letters into a meticulous quasi-scientific record, creating what many consider the first true work of modern journalism and a foundational text for meteorology. His work moved the conversation away from pure superstition and toward systematic observation. It was one of the very first attempts to quantify a natural disaster, to understand its scope and mechanics through collective human experience. The Great Storm forced a maritime nation to confront its absolute vulnerability to the skies. It demonstrated that even the most powerful navy on Earth was no match for the raw chaos of the atmosphere, a lesson that would echo through the centuries as humanity slowly learned to read the signs in the wind. History was about to repeat itself on a frozen, blood-stained stage. More than a century after Napoleon's retreat, another invader was lured deep into Russia with the same promises of a quick victory. In June 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million Axis soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, surged across the border. The German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, had crushed Poland and France in weeks, and Hitler was confident the Soviet Union would collapse just as quickly. The early months seemed to prove him right. Soviet forces were encircled and destroyed by the millions. By early December, German advance units were within sight of the Moscow suburbs. They could see the spires of the Kremlin through their field glasses. The Soviet government had begun to evacuate, and panic was spreading through the capital. But then, the Russian winter arrived with a vengeance. It came earlier and far more brutally than anyone had anticipated. The autumn rains had already turned the Russian roads into impassable seas of mud, known as Rasputitsa, which bogged down the German mechanized columns. Then the temperature plummeted. The winter of 1941 was the coldest in decades. Thermometers read -40 degrees and the mercury froze solid. The German soldiers were still wearing their summer uniforms. They had no insulated boots, no heavy winter coats, and no white camouflage. Frostbite became an epidemic. Men lost fingers, toes, and entire limbs. Machine guns jammed because their oil had frozen. Tanks and trucks would not start, their engines' blocks cracked by the cold. The German offensive, a machine that had seemed unstoppable just months before, simply froze in its tracks. This sudden halt was the miracle the Soviet Union desperately needed. It gave the Red Army, which had been on the brink of disintegration, a precious window to regroup. Fresh, well-equipped Siberian divisions, trained for winter combat, were rushed from the east to defend Moscow. They attacked the shivering, immobile German lines with a ferocity the invaders could not withstand. The Nazi advance was thrown back from the gates of the capital. This failure at Moscow was the first major defeat for the German army in the entire war. It proved that the Blitzkrieg was not invincible. More importantly, it shattered the myth of German invulnerability and transformed the conflict into the brutal war of attrition that Hitler could not win. The Eastern Front would consume the vast majority of Germany's military resources for the next 4 years, at a cost of millions of lives. All of it hinged on that one unforgiving winter. The same climate that had broken an emperor now broke a Führer, proving that Russia itself was a weapon no invading army could ever hope to conquer. Even the most brilliant victory can be poisoned by the very conditions that made it possible. In the spring of 1863, the American Civil War reached a critical point. Confederate General Robert E. Lee faced a Union army more than twice the size of his own, led by General Joseph Hooker. Confident and outnumbering his opponent, Hooker executed a clever flanking maneuver, placing his massive force in a dense Virginia forest known as the Wilderness, right at Lee's doorstep. He believed Lee had only 2 bad choices, retreat or face certain defeat. But Lee, defying all conventional military wisdom, made a third choice. He decided to split his already outnumbered force. He gave his most trusted and aggressive commander, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, the audacious task of taking 28,000 men on a secret 12-mile march through the woods to attack the Union's exposed right flank. The success of this desperate plan hinged entirely on 2 things: secrecy and surprise. The dense, tangled forest provided the cover, but it was the weather that delivered the final, crucial element. As the afternoon wore on, a thick, soupy fog began to creep through the woods, muffling sound and reducing visibility to almost nothing. Under this gray blanket, Jackson's long column of infantry completed its march completely undetected. They formed a battle line over a mile long, hidden in the trees and fog, just a few hundred yards from utterly unsuspecting Union soldiers who were cooking their dinners, playing cards, and resting completely unprepared for an attack. When the order was given, the Confederate line erupted from the fog with a terrifying, screaming rebel yell. The Union flank crumpled in sheer panic. The assault was a stunning, total success, driving the Union army back for miles in chaotic disarray. As night fell, the victory was complete, but the fog that had been their greatest ally now became their curse. Eager to press his advantage and cut off the Union retreat, Jackson rode out ahead of his own lines with his staff to scout the new positions in the deep darkness and lingering fog. As they rode back toward Confederate lines, silhouetted and shrouded in the gloom, a regiment from North Carolina mistook them for Union cavalry. A volley of musket fire shattered the quiet. Jackson was hit 3 times by his own men. His left arm was shattered and had to be amputated. Though he initially seemed to be recovering, he soon developed pneumonia and died 8 days later. His final words were, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." The loss was catastrophic for the Confederacy. Stonewall Jackson was more than just a brilliant general. He was the aggressive, unpredictable hammer in Lee's strategic hand. Lee would famously say, "He has lost his left arm and I have lost my right." Without Jackson's relentless drive and tactical genius, the Confederate Army was never the same. Just 2 months later, at the Battle of Gettysburg, many historians believe that the absence of Jackson's decisive leadership was a critical factor in Lee's defeat, the turning point of the entire war. The same fog that enabled the South's greatest tactical victory also delivered the personal tragedy that doomed its cause, a stark reminder that fortune, even when it favors you, can be a double-edged sword. A deep chill settled over Europe for generations. The period known as the Little Ice Age was a climatic shift that spanned centuries, but its effects crested in the 1600s with a ferocity that reshaped society. This was not a single harsh winter, but a relentless, multi-generational grind of cooler temperatures and miserably wet summers. The sun became a stranger, and the growing seasons shrank year after year. Across the continent, crops that had sustained populations for centuries simply failed. Wheat and rye rotted in waterlogged fields, and grape harvests in vineyards across France and Germany were ruined by unseasonable frosts. The result was a series of catastrophic famines that swept through communities with a grim regularity. In France alone, the Great Frost of 1709 killed hundreds of thousands, a disaster so severe that it was said the birds froze in mid-air and wine froze solid in cellars. But this was just one event in a long, cold century of suffering. The constant state of scarcity and hunger created a powder keg of social unrest. Peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, were pushed to the absolute brink, burdened by taxes and tithes even as their children starved. This pervasive agrarian crisis created the tinder that would eventually ignite into revolution. When the people of France finally stormed the Bastille in 1789, they were not just fighting for liberty and equality. They were fighting for bread. The desperation born from decades of failed harvests and empty bellies was a primary fuel for the fire that consumed the old regime. This climatic influence even seeped into the art of the era. Before the Little Ice Age, how many painters had truly focused on winter? The genre was a rarity. But as the cold deepened, a new artistic reality emerged. The Dutch masters, in particular, began to immortalize the frozen world outside their windows. Pieter Bruegel the Elder's iconic paintings, like Hunters in the Snow, do not depict a brief cold snap. They show a world permanently transformed, with villagers going about their lives on solid ice, their breath hanging in the air, the landscape locked in a deep and silent freeze. These works are more than just beautiful scenes. They are historical documents of a world grappling with a new, harsh normal. The very way people saw their world was colored by the unrelenting cold, proving that climate does not just alter harvests and politics, but can reshape the human imagination itself. The Caribbean holds a secret, the deadliest Atlantic hurricane ever recorded. In October 1780, at the height of the American Revolution, a storm of almost biblical power formed near the Cape Verde Islands. This was not merely a hurricane, it was a monster that seemed to feed on the very heat of the tropical waters, growing in size and fury as it churned westward. By the time it reached the Lesser Antilles, it was a perfect storm, a whirlwind of unimaginable destruction with a diameter that spanned hundreds of miles. Its first victims were the great European navies, whose ships were locked in a delicate dance of war. The British and French fleets, vital for controlling the lucrative sugar islands and blockading enemy ports, were caught completely unaware. The hurricane's eye passed directly over the island of Barbados with sustained winds that historians estimate may have exceeded 200 miles per hour. It scraped the island clean. Every tree, every house, and every fortress was flattened. The stone walls of the military prison were thrown down, and the cannons were tossed about like twigs. From there, the storm raged on, swallowing the islands of Martinique and St. Lucia whole. The carnage at sea was even more complete. The British fleet anchored off St. Lucia was utterly ravaged. Ships of the line, the most powerful warships afloat, were lifted from the water and thrown onto the shore, reduced to piles of splintered wood. The French fleet, blockading the British at Martinique, suffered a similar fate, with dozens of warships and hundreds of transport vessels sent to the bottom. The human toll was almost beyond comprehension. On the island of Martinique alone, more than 9,000 people perished. In total, it is believed that over 20,000 people lost their lives, a staggering number that makes this single event the deadliest natural disaster in Atlantic history. The strategic impact was immediate and profound. Both the British and French navies were crippled, their ability to project power in the Caribbean temporarily shattered. This forced a dramatic shift in naval strategy, as both nations realized that concentrating their precious fleets in the hurricane-prone Caribbean during the late summer and autumn was an unacceptable risk. The colonial balance of power was thrown into chaos, disrupting supply lines and military campaigns back in the 13 colonies. The Great Hurricane of 1780 was a brutal reminder that in the Age of Sail, the greatest admiral was not a man but the atmosphere itself. The humid air over Gettysburg was thick with the promise of more violence. For 2 brutal days in July 1863, Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army had hammered the Union lines, coming agonizingly close to a decisive breakthrough. On the evening of July 2nd, his forces had seized a critical foothold on Culp's Hill and the Peach Orchard, and the entire Union right flank was hanging by a thread. Lee's plan for the next morning was simple and devastating, a massive, coordinated assault all along the line before the Union Army could recover. He would strike at Culp's Hill at first light, and once that attack was underway, General James Longstreet's Fresh Corps would slam into the Union center. This synchronized hammer blow, Lee was convinced, would shatter the Federal Army, but the atmosphere had other plans. Just after midnight, the skies opened. A torrential, unseasonable downpour drenched the battlefield, turning the dusty roads into impassable quagmires and soaking the soldiers to the bone. This was not a gentle summer shower, it was a deluge that lasted for hours, and its impact was immediate. The planned early morning attack on Culp's Hill was delayed, then delayed again. The rain made it nearly impossible to move artillery into position, and the wet ground muffled the sound of marching feet, creating chaos and confusion in the Confederate ranks. More critically, the storm severed communication. The crucial coordination between Lee's different corps commanders broke down completely in the blinding rain and deep mud. The synchronized attack, the very heart of Lee's strategy, never materialized. Instead of a simultaneous, overwhelming assault, the Confederate efforts became a series of disjointed, piecemeal attacks that the Union defenders were able to beat back one by one. The precious hours lost to the storm gave the Union commander, General George Meade, exactly what he needed: time. He used the downpour to reinforce his lines, shift his reserves, and prepare for what was to come. By the time the rain finally ceased and the ground began to steam in the midday sun, Lee's original, brilliant plan was in ruins. With his options dwindling and the element of surprise lost, he made a fateful and desperate decision. He would stake everything on a direct, frontal assault against the very center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. This was the genesis of Pickett's charge, that long, terrible march across an open field that would end in catastrophic failure and become the turning point of the American Civil War. The rain on the night of July 2nd did not win the battle for the Union, but it stole from Lee the one thing he needed most: the perfect timing that could have broken his enemy. A single night's weather had reshaped the entire third day of the battle, preserving a nation that was still struggling to be born. Deep in the lush heart of Central America, the Maya built a civilization of breathtaking sophistication. Their soaring pyramids, precise astronomical calendars, and complex glyphic writing system marked the peak of the Classic period, a golden age that lasted for centuries. Yet by the 10th century, this vibrant world had fallen silent. The great ceremonial centers like Tikal, Palenque, and Capon were abandoned to the jungle, their palaces empty and their plazas reclaimed by roots and vines. For generations, the collapse was one of history's great enigmas. Where did the people go, and why would they leave their magnificent stone cities behind? The answer appears to be written not in stone but in mud. Scientists drilling into the sediments of nearby lakes, like Lake Chichancanab in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, have uncovered a startling climatic diary. The layers of mud contain fossilized pollen and the shells of tiny organisms that are incredibly sensitive to rainfall. By analyzing these sediment cores, researchers can reconstruct a precise rainfall record stretching back over 1,000 years. The story they tell is one of catastrophe. The data reveals that the century surrounding the Maya collapse was struck by a series of extreme multi-decade droughts. Some of these dry periods were the most severe the region had experienced in 2,000 years. Rainfall may have dropped by 40 to 50%. For a civilization entirely dependent on seasonal rains to fill their reservoirs and water their crops, this was a death sentence. Imagine the great reservoirs of Tikal, the lifeblood of the city, slowly evaporating under a relentless sun. The water level would have dropped year after year, leaving a white, mineralized bathtub ring on the limestone walls. The maize fields would have withered in the parched earth. Famine would have swept through the population, weakening people and making them vulnerable to disease. The social contract, the very faith in the king's divine power, would have evaporated faster than the water. The Maya rulers were seen as intermediaries with the gods, responsible for bringing the life-giving rains. When their prayers and rituals failed, season after season, their authority crumbled. The archaeological record shows the final, desperate acts. In some cities, priests made more and more frequent, and perhaps more frantic, sacrifices. In others, the common people simply walked away from their homes, leaving behind broken pots and unfinished tools. They likely dispersed into smaller, more sustainable communities in search of reliable water sources. The great classic Maya civilization did not vanish in a single moment, but it was starved and thirsted into fragmentation by a climate it could not control. Their story is a haunting lesson in vulnerability, a reminder that even the most advanced societies are built upon a foundation as fragile as the next rainy season. A different kind of wind would soon decide the fate of another English crown. In 1688, King James II, a devout Catholic, sat on the throne of a predominantly Protestant England. His policies favoring Catholics and his new male heir, who promised a continuing Catholic line of succession, sent a wave of alarm through the political establishment. In secret, a group of powerful nobles known as the Immortal Seven sent an invitation to William of Orange, the Protestant Dutch stadtholder and husband to James's own Protestant daughter, Mary. They asked him to invade England and rescue their religion and their liberties. William assembled a massive invasion fleet of over 400 ships, an armada larger than the Spanish one of a century before, and set sail for England in October. The plan was incredibly risky. The English navy was powerful and loyal to the king, and autumn storms in the North Sea were notoriously dangerous. For 2 weeks, William's fleet was battered by a strong, persistent southwesterly wind that prevented it from even leaving the Dutch coast. The delay was agonizing, giving King James ample time to prepare his defenses. Then, on November 1st, the wind did something extraordinary. It shifted. The southwesterly gale that had blocked William reversed direction completely, becoming a powerful easterly wind, the famous Protestant wind. This new wind did 2 things at once. It blew William's vast fleet perfectly down the English Channel, and it blew the larger, waiting English fleet directly up into the Thames estuary, where it was trapped by the same wind, unable to sail out and engage the invaders. For 6 days, William's ships sailed unopposed along the English coast, while the English sailors sat stranded, watching from their harbors. William landed at Torbay on November 5th, a date celebrated in England as Guy Fawkes Day, a potent symbol of Protestant deliverance from Catholic plots. He marched on London without firing a shot. King James, his support evaporating and his military commanders defecting, ultimately fled to France. This was the Glorious Revolution, a bloodless coup that changed the course of British history. The new monarchs, William and Mary, accepted the crown only after agreeing to the Bill of Rights in 1689, a document that dramatically limited the power of the monarchy, established the supremacy of Parliament, and laid the foundation for the modern constitutional monarchy. The Protestant wind was seen as a divine endorsement of this new political order, a force of nature that had not shattered a fleet, but had instead guided one to shore to peacefully reshape a nation's government. A new kind of killer descended on London in December 1952, one born from the very heart of its industry. It began on a cold Friday, the 5th, as a high-pressure system settled over the city, creating an unusual temperature inversion. A layer of warm air acted like a lid, trapping a blanket of cold, stagnant air beneath it. This weather event alone would have meant a foggy day, but combined with the millions of coal fires burning in London's homes and the unchecked exhaust from its factories and power stations, it created something far worse. The fog was no longer made of water vapor. It was a thick, yellowish-black smog, a toxic soup of soot, sulfur dioxide, and other poisonous chemicals. For 5 days, the city was suffocated. Visibility dropped to just a few feet, bringing all transportation to a halt. Buses, cars, and even ambulances were abandoned in the streets. The smog was so thick and acrid that it seeped indoors, forcing theaters to close because the audience could not see the stage. It stained curtains and clothing and left a foul, metallic taste in the back of your throat. But the most dangerous effects were invisible. The sulfur dioxide in the air attacked the human respiratory system, inflaming lungs and shutting down airways. At first, the death toll seemed normal, just a bad week for the elderly and infirm. The city's mortuaries quickly ran out of space, and coffins were in such short supply that they had to be rationed. It was only weeks later, when statisticians analyzed the mortality figures, that the true horror was revealed. The Great Smog had killed approximately 12,000 people, with many more thousands suffering long-term health effects. The public and political outrage was immediate and profound. This was not a distant famine or a foreign war. This was a man-made disaster that had struck at the very heart of the empire. The smog proved that the price of industrial progress could be measured in human lives. The pressure for change became unstoppable, leading directly to the landmark Clean Air Act of 1956. This revolutionary legislation established smoke-free zones, provided grants for households to convert to cleaner fuels, and moved power stations away from urban centers. It was one of the world's first and most decisive environmental laws, a direct response to a catastrophe witnessed by millions. The Great Smog of London did more than clear the air. It cleared a path for the modern environmental movement, proving that when a crisis becomes personal, humanity can find the will to change its entire way of life. A tinderbox was waiting for a single spark in London. The summer of 1666 had been one of the hottest and driest in memory, a relentless heat that baked the city's cramped medieval streets. The Thames River had shrunk to a sluggish trickle, and the countless wooden houses, shops, and warehouses were desiccated, their timbers as dry as bone. For months, the air had been still and heavy, but on the night of September 2nd, everything changed. A strong, persistent easterly wind began to blow, funneling through the city's narrow, overhung lanes. It was this wind that transformed a simple accident in a bakery on Pudding Lane into an unstoppable force of nature. The initial fire was not immediately alarming, but the gusting wind snatched burning embers from the bakery's roof and hurled them like torches onto the thatched roofs of neighboring buildings. Within an hour, the fire was leaping from house to house, a rolling wave of heat and flame that moved faster than a person could run. The city's primitive firefighting methods were utterly useless against this storm-driven inferno. The flames created their own weather, a roaring vortex of superheated air that tore tiles from roofs and shattered windows ahead of the main fire front. For 3 days, the easterly gale never relented, pushing the fire westward across the city. It consumed St. Paul's Cathedral, melted the lead on its roof, and gutted the great church. It jumped the defensive fire breaks created by blowing up houses with gunpowder. By the time the wind finally died down on the 5th of September, 4/5 of the medieval city of London was gone. Over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and countless public buildings had been reduced to smoking ash. Yet from this total devastation arose a phoenix. The fire cleared the ground for a complete rebirth. The old, plague-ridden, rat-infested warren of wooden buildings was swept away. The renowned architect Sir Christopher Wren was commissioned to redesign the city, resulting in a new, more resilient London built of stone and brick, with wider streets and a magnificent new St. Paul's Cathedral as its centerpiece, the Great Fire was a horrific tragedy, but the weather that drove it also forged the modern city we know today. A stark reminder that destruction can sometimes be the necessary price of progress. Even Alexander the Great could not conquer the sky. After a decade of undefeated conquest that stretched from Greece to the edge of India, his army stood on the banks of the mighty Indus River in 326 BC. They had crushed empires and crossed deserts, but nothing had prepared them for the monsoon. This was not the occasional storm of the Mediterranean, but a seasonal deluge of biblical proportions. For weeks, the heavens opened, unleashing torrents of warm, relentless rain that turned the world into a sodden nightmare. The dry riverbeds of the Indus Valley swelled into raging, impassable torrents, sweeping away men and pack animals in an instant. The ground became a bottomless sea of clinging mud that sucked the sandals from their feet and made every step an exhausting struggle. For soldiers accustomed to the dry heat of Persia, this humid, waterlogged world was a form of torture. Their legendary bronze armor, a symbol of invincibility, rusted on their bodies, leather straps rotted, and bows became useless as the glue in their composite limbs dissolved in the damp. The constant, muggy heat bred clouds of insects, and disease began to stalk the ranks. Dysentery and fever felled veteran warriors who had survived 100 battles. Morale, the very fuel of Alexander's campaigns, began to dissolve as completely as the landscape around them. His Macedonian troops, the core of his army, had followed him to the ends of the known world. They had heard rumors of even greater kingdoms further east across the Ganges, but the prospect of marching deeper into this drowning, feverish land was the final straw. The men had not seen their homes in over 10 years. They were exhausted, sick, and psychologically broken by a climate they could not fight. At the Hyphosis River, his army mutinied. They refused to go any further. Alexander, the king who had never known defeat in battle, was finally defeated by the will of his own men and the weather that had broken them. He was forced to turn back, ending his eastward expansion forever. This moment at the Hyphosis River was one of the great what-ifs of history. Had the monsoon been less severe or his troops more resilient, the course of Asian and European history might have been dramatically different. Alexander's empire reached its final, easternmost limit not because of an enemy army, but because of the unending, demoralizing power of the rain. A man's final journey ended in a sudden, blinding alpine storm. In 1991, 2 German hikers high in the Ötztal Alps stumbled upon a brown, leathery corpse half embedded in the ice. They assumed it was the unfortunate victim of a recent climbing accident, but the discovery that followed was far more extraordinary. This was Ötzi the Iceman, a Neolithic hunter who had died over 5,000 years earlier, his body and belongings preserved with stunning perfection by the very ice that killed him. He was not buried, but naturally mummified, frozen in time by a rapid and tragic change in the weather. The evidence etched into his final moments is a chilling detective story. Ötzi was a well-equipped man carrying a copper axe, a bow, a quiver of arrows, and a primitive medical kit of fungi. He was fleeing up the mountain, but he was not alone. An arrowhead lodged deep in his shoulder tells us he was shot from behind. He also had a fresh cut on his hand, suggesting a violent confrontation just hours before. Wounded and bleeding, he climbed high into the treacherous pass, seeking escape, and then the weather turned. A sudden, violent snowstorm likely swept across the high peaks, a common and deadly occurrence in the Alps. Exhausted, injured, and unable to find shelter, Ötzi simply lay down in a small rocky hollow. The temperature plummeted and the snow began to fall, covering him quickly. He did not freeze slowly, but almost instantly. This rapid freezing was the key to his preservation. The deep cold desiccated his tissues and prevented the bacteria of decomposition from ever beginning their work. The layers of snow compacted into ice, creating a perfect, natural deep freeze that held him in a state of suspended animation for 53 centuries. His preservation is so complete that scientists have been able to determine his last meal, a feast of wild goat and red deer, along with grains and roots. They know he suffered from Lyme disease and worn joints, and they even identified the specific types of pollen in his gut, revealing he died in the late spring or early summer. The ice did not just preserve a body, it preserved a life, a snapshot of an entire world from the Copper Age. When the glacier that held him for millennia finally retreated, it gave up its secret. The very storm that ended Ötzi's life became the force that immortalized him, offering us an unparalleled, intimate window into a past we could otherwise only guess at. Even the most rigid ideological standoff could be broken by a shared enemy from the skies. At the height of the Cold War in August 1969, Hurricane Camille began to churn in the Caribbean, rapidly intensifying into a meteorological monster. It would soon become one of the most powerful hurricanes ever to strike the United States, but its first target was the island of Cuba, a Soviet client state and a focal point of global tension. Nestled in a bay on the southern coast was a highly sensitive secret, a Soviet submarine base. This was not just a few ships, it was a strategic asset, a forward operating base for the Soviet Navy's ballistic missile submarines, the very core of their nuclear deterrence. As Camille gathered strength, barreling directly toward this coastline, American intelligence watched with growing alarm. They knew the location and the immense value of the base. They also knew the storm's unprecedented power. A direct hit would not only destroy the facility but likely sink several submarines, potentially causing a massive loss of life and scattering radioactive material from nuclear reactors and warheads across the Caribbean. The potential for an international disaster and a catastrophic escalation of tensions was very real. In a situation fraught with mutual suspicion, an extraordinary decision was made at the highest levels of the US government. Instead of letting the storm become a weapon of nature against their adversary, they chose to use their superior weather forecasting technology as a tool of diplomacy. A direct and secret communication channel was opened with the Soviet Union. American meteorologists provided their Soviet counterparts with detailed, precise tracking data and forecasts for Camille, specifically highlighting the grave danger to the naval base at Bahia de Cienfuegos. This was not a public gesture, but a quiet, professional exchange between military and scientific personnel. The Soviets, faced with this irrefutable data, had to listen. They were given a precious window of time to secure their assets, to move their submarines to safer, deeper waters, and to batten down the facility as much as possible. When Camille finally slammed into the coast, it did so with sustained winds estimated at over 175 miles per hour and a storm surge that obliterated everything in its path. The damage was still severe, but the Soviet loss of life and material was dramatically reduced because of the American warning. In the grand chessboard of the Cold War, this was a single, quiet move, but its implications were profound. It demonstrated that beneath the rhetoric of mutually assured destruction, there was a shared vulnerability to natural forces and a capacity for pragmatic cooperation. This unlikely collaboration over a hurricane forecast created a tiny crack in the icy facade, a precedent that would subtly pave the way for future environmental and scientific agreements between the superpowers. It proved that even in the darkest moments of division, the need to survive a common threat could, for a moment, make enemies into reluctant partners. A profound and prolonged drought tightened its grip on Syria for 4 agonizing years. This was not a simple dry spell, but a catastrophic climate event that saw rainfall levels plummet to their lowest in recorded history. The country's vital agricultural heartland, particularly the northeast region, was transformed into a dust bowl. Ancient groundwater wells ran dry, and the Euphrates River dwindled to a shallow stream. Farmers who had tilled the land for generations watched their wheat and barley fields wither and die. Their livestock, a primary source of wealth and food, perished in the fields from thirst and starvation. With no harvest and no income, these rural communities faced a stark choice: stay and face destitution, or leave everything behind. This triggered one of the largest internal migrations in the nation's modern history. An estimated 1.5 million people were displaced from the countryside, flooding into the peripheries of cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs. They crammed into makeshift settlements on the edges of urban centers that were already straining under the weight of a rapidly growing population and a government unable or unwilling to provide adequate services. These informal suburbs became tinderboxes of discontent, overcrowded and desperately poor. The new arrivals competed with the urban poor for scarce jobs, water, and housing, driving tensions ever higher. The Assad government, meanwhile, withdrew the subsidies that had long supported farmers for diesel fuel and fertilizer, a move that felt like a final betrayal to a population already on the brink. The social contract between the people and the state was fracturing under the unrelenting sun. When the Arab Spring swept across the Middle East in early 2011, these marginalized communities, both the original urban poor and the newly arrived climate refugees, were primed for protest. They were the first to take to the streets in the southern city of Daraa, their grievances over unemployment, corruption, and a lack of basic dignity now magnified by years of environmental collapse. The drought did not single-handedly cause the Syrian civil war, a conflict fueled by deep sectarian divides and brutal political repression, but it acted as the essential catalyst, the accelerant poured on a smoldering fire. It shattered the rural economy, displaced millions, and created the precise conditions of desperation and concentrated anger that allowed a local protest to escalate into a cataclysm that would engulf the entire nation. The Syrian tragedy stands as a chilling, modern testament to a timeless truth. When the climate shifts, it is not just the landscape that changes, but the very foundations of human society. From the divine winds that saved nations to the droughts that crumbled civilizations, our journey reveals a humbling truth. The weather is the silent author of so much human drama, an unseen hand that has toppled empires on a whim and saved revolutions with a single bank of fog. It is history's ultimate wild card, unpredictable and utterly impartial. These 25 moments are not just stories of survival or defeat, they are reminders of our profound and permanent vulnerability. A sudden frost can break the greatest army, a persistent drought can ignite a modern war, and a calm sea can disguise the approach of an iceberg. We build our cities and our societies, believing we are the masters of our fate, yet we remain forever at the mercy of the sky. So the next time you feel a sudden shift in the wind or watch a storm gather on the horizon, consider the invisible forces at work. What storms are brewing right now that will rewrite the maps of tomorrow? What subtle shifts in our climate are already setting the stage for the history books of the next century? The conversation between humanity and the atmosphere is far from over. We would love to hear your thoughts. Which of these weather-driven moments do you believe most profoundly altered the course of our world? Share your own historical mysteries in the comments below.